We're diving deep into the world of ICE appointments today, specifically what's been happening in South Florida. These recent news reports that came out they're pretty intense, I gotta say. We're talking about families, living every day with this fear that a routine check-in could end up like tearing their families apart.
Yeah, it's a tough reality for a lot of undocumented immigrants living in the U.S. They have to check in with ICE regularly, sometimes it's annually. It's part of what they call the catch and release policy.
Catch and release, okay. I feel like we hear that term tossed around a lot these days, but to be honest with you, I'm not totally clear on what it actually like means,
Well,
on the ground.
sure. So basically, it's this policy that allows certain undocumented immigrants to stay in the U.S. while they're waiting for their hearings in immigration court instead of being detained. It's been used historically a lot for families, asylum seekers, and people who are considered line risk, like they're not going to just disappear.
Mhm.
But with all these recent policy changes, it's gotten way more uncertain.
Gotcha. And that uncertainty, that's definitely a huge theme in these news reports. There's this one story I kept thinking about this guy named Juan. He was waiting at the ICE office in Miramar for his girlfriend and her daughter. They came here from Peru 4 years ago, and they've been checking in with ICE every year like they're supposed to. But the article talks about this like almost unbearable tension, as they're waiting, not knowing what's going to happen.
Yeah, I can only imagine, especially with all this stuff surrounding immigration in the political world right now. President Trump has said very clearly that his administration wants to do away with catch and release and increase deportations by a lot.
Yeah.
He actually said, quote, "We have successfully ended catch and release, and we're deporting 100% of all new trespassers apprehended at the border."
So even for people who've been following all the rules, the stakes are like super high right now. It really does feel like things are changing. And then there's this other story about Ermita Cervera. Her husband was actually detained at his ICE appointment. He came here from Cuba 3 years ago. And she was like rushing to get to the facility to bring him his medication. Absolutely terrified. It really shows you how quickly things can change.
Oh, absolutely. And her fear is completely understandable.
Mm.
Deportation can have some really serious and lasting consequences.
Yeah.
If someone's deported and then they try to come back to the U.S. without permission, they could end up in federal prison. And that's not even talking about the emotional impact of being separated from your family and everything.
So now we have these two families, and they're both facing this uncertain future. Did the news reports say what ended up happening to them?
Yeah, they did. And it's interesting because their outcomes were really different. So Juan's girlfriend and her daughter, they were actually released after like hours and hours of waiting and being questioned.
Right.
They had no criminal record, and they'd always gone to their ICE check-ins. So they were allowed to go home. Ermita's husband, though he wasn't so lucky, he was transferred over to the Crone Detention Center in Miami. That's usually the last stop before deportation.
Wow. So different. It's like almost random.
In a way, yeah. What's really worrying is that this uncertainty, it's even affecting people who haven't done anything wrong and are following all the rules. The wait times for these ICE appointments, they've gone through the roof.
Yeah.
There's this real sense of anxiety, even fear in immigrant communities.
So basically, nobody knows what to expect, even if they've been doing everything right.
Exactly. These news reports really highlight how important it is to have a lawyer if you're in this situation.
Hmm.
An immigration attorney could be a huge help in navigating this whole system, which is so complicated.
Especially when it feels like the rules are constantly changing, like trying to hit a moving target. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the bigger picture here. Like, what do these stories tell us about the state of immigration policy in the U.S. right now?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the current administration's focus on border security and stricter immigration enforcement, it's having a big impact on people and families. And it makes you think about due process and fairness and what the human cost of all these policy shifts really is.
Yeah, for sure. It's one thing to talk about this stuff, like in theory, but when you see the actual people and you hear their stories, it hits you differently.
It does. And it makes us ask ourselves these tough questions. What are the real consequences of these policies for the people who might be deported and for their families?
Right. It's not just numbers and abstract ideas. It's
Right.
real people's lives that are being turned upside down.
And those lives are often connected to the communities where they live.
Mhm.
Immigrants contribute so much to our economy and our culture. They become our friends and neighbors and coworkers.
It's about the fabric of our society. But it seems like we struggle to have a conversation about immigration that's both nuanced and compassionate.
It's true. But I think we need to have that conversation, even if it's difficult. We have to understand all the different parts of it. the challenges and the opportunities that come with immigration.
Totally agree. So let's dive a little deeper into that. We've been talking about the fear and uncertainty around these ICE appointments. But what about the history here? You mentioned earlier that things have shifted because of policy changes. Can you tell us a little more about how we got to this point?
Of course,
Yeah.
to really get the current situation, it helps to look back at the history of immigration to South Florida, especially from Cuba and Central America. Each wave of migration has brought its own unique set of circumstances and challenges.
Okay, I'm all ears. This is where it gets really interesting. Tell me everything.
South Florida has been kind of a magnet for immigrants for a long time,
Mm.
especially folks running from political stuff or, looking for better economic opportunities. And both of those are tied up in the stories we're talking about.
Right. Like with Juan's girlfriend and her daughter, who came from Peru, and Ermita's husband from Cuba, their stories are definitely different, but they fit into those bigger migration patterns.
Yeah, exactly. Take the Cuban community in South Florida, for example. They have a long and really complicated history. A lot of it goes back to the whole political situation between the U.S. and Cuba.
Hmm.
After the Cuban Revolution in '59, a ton of Cubans fled to the U.S., and South Florida became like a main destination. The U.S.'s policy toward Cuban migrants has gone back and forth over the years. Sometimes they're more welcoming, sometimes more restrictive.
So Ermita's husband's story, it's like a piece of this much bigger story that's been unfolding for decades.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have Juan's girlfriend and her daughter who came from Peru. Their story is more like what we're seeing lately with migration from Central America. We've seen this
Yeah.
big increase in Central American migrants coming to the U.S. A lot of that's driven by stuff like gang violence, poverty, climate change.
It's a good reminder that there are tons of reasons why people decide to leave their homes and try to start over somewhere new. And every new wave of migration, it brings its own challenges and it adds to the whole, changing makeup of American society.
You got it. Understanding the history and the politics behind all of this, it's super important if we want to have real discussions about immigration. It's not just about numbers and statistics. It's about understanding the human stories behind those numbers and what makes people migrate in the first place.
Totally. It's easy to get lost in all the abstract debate stuff. But when you hear those personal stories, it makes it real. Ermita rushing to the detention center with her husband's medication, like that image just stays with you.
It really does. It makes you realize that these immigration policies, they're not just about ideas. They affect real people, families, communities.
Speaking of the impact on people, you mentioned Ermita's husband being sent to the Chrome Detention Center. What exactly is that? What does it mean for someone in his situation?
So Chrome is a big immigration detention facility. It's in Miami-Dade County. It's basically a holding place for people who might be deported. When someone gets sent to Chrome, it's usually a pretty strong sign that they're starting the deportation process.
So that's really bad news for Ermita and her husband.
Unfortunately, it is. And their story is not unique. Lots of immigrants end up in places like Chrome, often without a good lawyer or any support.
It's a tough reminder of what many immigrants have to deal with all the challenges and uncertainty.
It is. And it shows how important it is for people to understand the immigration system better and push for policies that are more humane and compassionate.
We've talked a lot about the downsides of stricter immigration enforcement, but what about the other side? What are the arguments in favor of these policies?
There are some valid concerns for sure. People who want stricter border control often say it's crucial for national security, to keep out people who might be a threat. They also worry about the strain on social services and resources, especially in places with lots of immigrants.
And then there's the argument that we have to enforce immigration laws to keep things fair for the people who came here legally.
Right. And those are all important points to think about.
Yeah.
It's not about ignoring one side or the other. It's about trying to get all the different perspectives and having a productive conversation.
I think that's key, recognizing that it's a complicated issue with valid points on all sides.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that immigrants aren't all the same. They come from different places with different stories and experiences. They contribute to our society in so many ways.
Right. We can't forget about the individual stories and the human impact of these policy decisions. It's easy to get wrapped up in the political talk and the big debates, but in the end, this is about real people's lives. People like Juan and Ermita.
Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect way to move into the next part of our conversation. We've looked at the fear and uncertainty around ICE appointments, the historical context, and the arguments for and against tougher immigration rules. But where do we go from here? What can we do as individuals to make a difference in this issue? It's complicated, and it can feel pretty overwhelming.
That's the big question, right? It feels like such a huge issue, and it's hard to know where to even start. What actions can we actually take that will make a difference? I know it can feel that way, like where do you even begin? But I think maybe the first step is realizing that even little things can make a difference, you
Right.
know?
I agree. And I think one of the most important things we can do is just learn more,
Hmm.
really dig into these issues, go beyond the headlines and all the, quick takes you see everywhere. There's so much out there to learn. Articles, books, documentaries, podcasts, all kinds of stuff that can help us get a better, more in-depth understanding of how complicated immigration really is.
It's like what we were talking about earlier, right? Learning about the history of immigration in South Florida, all the different reasons why people migrate, the different policies they've had over the years. When you put it all together, it gives you a much broader perspective.
Exactly. And once we have that knowledge, we can use it to talk to our friends and family and coworkers in a way that's more, meaningful. We can challenge those stereotypes and wrong ideas, share the stories we've learned, and really push for policies that are more humane and compassionate.
So it's about becoming more informed, as citizens and using that knowledge to spread awareness and get people talking.
Right. And there are other things we can do too. Practical things like contacting our elected officials and letting them know how we feel about immigration policy. We can support organizations that give legal help and social services to immigrants. Or we can volunteer our time and resources to help people who need it.
Those are all really good ideas, and I think it's important to be careful about the language we use when we talk about immigration. It's easy to slip into generalizations and stereotypes, but we got to remember that immigrants aren't just one big group. They come from all different places with their own unique stories and experiences.
Yeah, that's so important. We have to see individuals, not just labels. And remember that every human being has dignity and worth no matter what their immigration status is.
I love that. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by this thought that even though immigration can seem super complicated and even scary at times, it really comes down to human connection.
I think you're right. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and acknowledging all the ways that immigrants make our society better and trying to create a world that's more just and welcoming for everyone.
It's about building bridges, not walls.
Exactly. And that takes empathy and open-mindedness and being willing to challenge our own assumptions.
That's a perfect way to put it. We've covered a lot today, from Juan and Armita's stories to the bigger picture of immigration and history and politics. It's been really eye-opening.
It has. And I hope that this deep dive has inspired our listeners to keep learning about this complex and always changing issue.
I hope so too. Because at the end of the day, the future of our country and the well-being of so many people depends on us being willing to have these tough conversations with compassion and understanding. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of ICE appointments in South Florida.